Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Where Work Meets Life. I'm Dr. Laura, and today's episode is on generations at work, leveraging strengths to bridge the gap with Giselle Kovary, who has a Master's of Arts in Communication Studies. She's a generational expert and head of learning and development at Optimus SBR. Giselle and I met a number of years ago. We've spoken together. We've collaborated together when it comes to generations at work and flexibility, remote work before the pandemic. So we were talking about that before the pandemic. She brings a wealth of experience. She's worked with over 26 Fortune 500 companies and delivered training and workshops and keynotes to thousands of people globally, 65,000 plus. She's an exceptional speaker, and she has 25 years of experience in learning and development and has really specialized in generations for the last 20 years, co-authoring 2 books, Loyalty Unplugged, How to Get, Keep, and Grow All 4 Generations, and Upgrade Now. She's also completed Canada's first national study a number of years ago on Generation Z or Generation Z, and she is unbelievably talented at everything she does. I'm really excited to have this conversation today with you. Welcome to the show, Giselle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laura, and it's just always a thrill to collaborate with you and hang out, so I'm so glad we're going to be chatting this afternoon.
Me too. So, Giselle, how did you first become interested in generations at work?
It's a really interesting path, and I think that never did I imagine that in 2024 we would still be talking about this issue. So if we rewind all the way back to 2003, I was working at the Schulich School of Business, and I was working with a colleague of mine, and we went for lunch, and we started to talk about some of the things that we were seeing and that we were feeling within our own careers as we were young women in our careers, and feeling as if organizations weren't really understanding what we wanted. And it didn't matter what industry or sector our peers were in, they were all saying the same thing, which was, I don't think my leader understands what I want. I'm not necessarily wanting to model my career after the way that leaders have had their careers. And I'm not feeling as if necessarily my values align with their values. And that got us thinking. And basically at the end of that lunch, we had a discussion, and my business partner, who we were in business for 12 years, we said we should start a business. We started working evenings and weekends while we were still employed, and then we left our job and started our company called Engine People Performance, which I then sold to Optimus 2 years ago and came in as head of learning development here. So it's been a long journey, and we really just thought that this was going to be an interesting topic. We knew that organizations were also struggling while we were struggling and our peers were struggling to understand how we fit within our careers. Organizations were also saying the same things. Back then, the term was high potential employee. And they said, we don't know how to get the high potential employee, how to keep them, how to manage them. They confuse us. And so we thought that there was probably going to be a hot topic there. And who knew that over 20 years later, it's still a hot topic.
No kidding. And now there are 5 generations. And we were talking before the show about how the traditionalists are mainly out of the workforce now, unless you're president of the US, I said. But you brought up that actually, no, there's a lot of traditionalists still around, or that mindset. Can you explain to us the fact that there are 5, what they are in a nutshell?
Absolutely. So the 5 generations that most people will be familiar with are the traditionalists, baby boomers, Gen Xers, of which I am one. I'm a Gen Xer. Millennials, they used to be referred to as Gen Ys, but then the term changed. So they're called millennials. And then the Gen Z, or as you said, Gen Z. And I use both terms interchangeably. And so when we think about the traditionalists, they're 79 and up, right? They're upwards into their hundreds. So do we have a lot of those people in the workforce? No, we don't. Having said that, there are still traditionalists who work because they want to and they like being engaged in the work environment. They may sit on boards and be board members or executive team members. They might, work in a part-time capacity. But fundamentally, there's still a traditionalist mindset in lots of industries and sectors. So we can talk about that in a minute. Then we've got our baby boomers. They're between 60 and 78 years old now. So that cohort we often hear about in Canada, right, that are retiring and they're moving. The thinking and the intention was that they were going to retire and create all this space for Gen Xers to move into leadership roles. That hasn't necessarily played out, but we've got those boomers. They're at the senior leadership levels and certainly leading organizations. Gen Xers, 44 to 59 years old, so just coming up to, that retirement age. If people retired in their early 50s, they may be Gen Xers, and then moving into sort of the classic retirement ages of 60, 65, and 70. Then we've got our millennials, they're 29 to 43. And what's interesting about this generation is so many people still think that they're young, right? They say, oh, that's the babysitter. No, they're the boss. They're actually not that young anymore. And they, again, are in organizations at all levels, right? But certainly in the leadership roles, and depending on industry and sectors that we work within, we're seeing a lot of millennials, and they're really challenging organizations and structures to think differently. Then we have our youngest cohort, and that's the Gen Z or Gen Zs. They're between 12 and 28, so big range, right? We've got individuals that haven't yet entered into the work world yet, and then we've got people that are clearly, established in their careers. They may have graduated right out of university or college, gone into the workforce. They may have gone right from high school into the workforce, let alone the Gen Zs that have been working part-time while they've been going to school. So there's a lot of touch points for organizations to have had Gen Zs as employees and what their expectations are. So we look across these 5 generations. We don't just speak about one generation because we don't live and work in a bubble, right? We work with different generations all the time. We need to be able to connect and engage and be able to motivate across the 5 generations, and we need to be able to collaborate as colleagues.
Wonderfully put. Now, I've always thought about this fact that there's a lot of variability within each generation. So I'm a Gen X, you're a Gen X, we're different from each other. People have different values across the same generation. So how do you go about making sure that we're not stereotyping or typecasting within your generational work, Giselle?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think the reason why it's important to address it is twofold. One is there's obviously a lot of awareness now of how we don't want to label people or stereotype in general. And we never should have done that, but we are much more conscious in our society now about ensuring that we recognize the uniqueness and the diversity of everyone. And I completely agree with that. So first and foremost, we want to make sure that I often say in my presentations is there's the fine legal print. The data that we're sharing is at a macro level, right? It's looking at what are some of the common themes and trends across generations. And that's important to understand if you are a leader in an organization, if you are in part of a community organization, you're engaging anyone in the community. If you are in a volunteer role, right? Whatever level you're in, you can really understand this data and apply it to how you can better connect, communicate, and collaborate across the different generations. So we are always speaking about it at a macro level. And what I say is this never replaces the need to understand people at the micro level, the individual. So what does Dr. Laura care about? What is she like? What are the uniquenesses of her? So we need to always overlay that on and say, okay, what do we know about the Gen Xers? But then where does this align with, Dr. Laura's values and expectations, and where doesn't it? And so we need to make sure that we do that. But just as we do in other forms of diversity, for example, not all men and not all women are the same, but we speak about gender differences in an intelligent way. We do the same with generations. Not everyone in a generation is going to align with this, but after over 20 years, I have literally thousands of anecdotes of when people will come up and say, oh my goodness, you so described me, or you described my children, you described my partner. And it's because there is enough of a baseline to say this is what, this generation believes and thinks, and we want to look at it from that perspective. The other piece, and I think I want to dive a little deeper into this one, is, and this is what we talked about before the show, is it's less important the year you're born and more about your generational identity. How do you identify? So when we speak and we work with organizations and leaders, it's really about recognizing what are those 5 mindsets. So you absolutely will have people within your team and your organization that might be 22 years old who are, according to age, a Gen Z, but in fact, they think and act like a traditionalist. They've come from a traditionalist culture, traditionalist background, traditionalist upbringing, and they're really very much aligned with this traditionalist ideology, mentality, perspective, values. And they're working with another Gen Z and they're not getting along. And people are saying, well, what do you mean? They're the two young people. You should figure it out. So we remove the age ranges from the work that we do when we look at organizational behaviors. And we say, what are the mindsets that we hold within our organizations or within our teams or within our communities? And I think that's more powerful to really recognize. And so you might find, and as you have over the years as we've talked, you might find that your age is Gen Xer. I don't think I'm outing you. You just said that, right? Or my age is a Gen Xer, but you might align with your mindset as a millennial.
I am actually a Gen Z, so thank you very much for thinking I'm an Xer.
Well, you look it. You look it.
Thank you. No, I'm a proud Gen Xer, and I feel like our generation, Giselle, is a small but mighty generation that really bridges the boomers and the millennials, right? Like we have to work with both and understand both mindsets. But I'm really with you in terms of the mindset point. I think that's just brilliant because with the whole example of all people must come back to the office to work, I see that as a very traditionalist slash boomer mentality, but I'm seeing it in some of my Gen X peers, and my millennial people. And I'm thinking, what is going on here? But that's a mindset, isn't it?
It is. And many things have a mindset and an alignment to a mindset. And what you're really alluding to here is the organizational culture. And so we can have organizations that are run by Gen Xers or by millennials, but they still think and act like traditionalist organizations. And that's often because they may be in a very traditionalist type industry. So I'd suggest to you banking, insurance, oil and gas, government still tend to be very traditionalist in their structures and in their thinking. And those leaders have still maintained that organizational culture and that organizational thinking. So absolutely, when we look at some of the policies and the expectations of employees, it can be rooted in that. And traditionalists mindsets, ideologies, perspectives really have been very, very strong in our organizations. They have shaped our organizational cultures and they are still often used as the benchmark. So as I always say, when we say someone's got a really great work ethic, it's because it's being benchmarked against how traditionalists defined a work ethic. It is not the way that, for example, a millennial or the Gen Z has benchmarked work ethic. Now, by the way, all generations have a work ethic, but it's really recognizing how their work style might be different. And so all of these things come into play when we think about our organizations, the cultures that we have, that we work within, and how we might interpret or misinterpret someone's actions and behaviors.
Wonderfully put. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about Loyalty Unplugged, that book, as well as your other book, Upgrade Now. So just in a nutshell, what is each book about? And then we're going to talk about how things have shifted since those books came out.
Yeah, Upgrade Now was Loyalty Unplugged was our first book and Upgrade Now was our second. And our first book really is still the foundation of much of the work that we do, but we've updated it obviously to include in the fifth generation, to include the Gen Zs. And the reason why I say it's foundational is because what we really looked at, and we continue to do this in our research, is what are the generational identities, but what are the values, expectations, and behaviors that each generation holds? And what's been interesting to see over 20 years of research, both our own as well as others that are researching in this space, because this space is now ballooned. It's a whole industry now, which didn't exist when we started our business way back in 2003. Nobody was really speaking about this issue, certainly not in Canada and very few in North America. And now it's a massive industry. So when we look at our research and other researchers' data, is what we found is that over time, each of the generational core values haven't dramatically changed. Because often it was used, Dr. Laura, as the way to discount what younger people wanted or were asking for. So if people were saying, I want flexibility at work, or I want to make sure that, yes, I can work from home, even before we had COVID, or I want to make sure that I have an opportunity to have a secondment because I want to go traveling, take 6 months or a year off, or I want to make sure that I'm having more coaching and feedback. Often the discounting by older generations. I don't use the word older very often. I like to say experienced. They're more experienced in age than I am. But the more experienced generations said, oh, you know what, that's nice. That's nice to hear that you want all of these things, young person. But just wait until, you get into the work world and then you got a dog and a house and a mortgage and some kids. You're going to have to suck it up and behave the way I did. And what we found over the last 20 years is that the core generational values are not changing. So as Gen Xers, we've not grown up to become baby boomers. Baby boomers did not become traditionalists. Right? Millennials are not becoming Gen Xers. So we're not actually, life stages is an important piece, but we're not actually changing our core values dramatically. And the reason why I think that's important is because when we research about the generations, it is still a core value, and we can look at how it may morph over one's lifetime, but the core value remains.
Interesting. So, yeah, when you and I first met and we spoke together on flexibility and how the different generations value flexibility differently. And then COVID hits. And I'm just wondering about how COVID and its aftermath have maybe shift some generational values, especially of the Gen Z. So growing up as students in COVID, right? School or post-secondary students, how might that have affected their values today that you're seeing when you're looking at Gen Z research?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of shifts for all of us, but especially for the Gen Zs. And the reason being is that what we know from the research is that generational identities really are formed during our coming of age period, which, has been identified in the research to be the first 15 to 16 years of our life that binds us together as a cohort and shapes our worldview. So for that youngest part of the Gen Zs that were experiencing their life-defining events, their coming of age period during COVID, it had a major impact. So we know this, right? Young people didn't have an opportunity to go to graduation. They missed having their prom. They couldn't go on the year-end school trip. They had major milestone birthdays. Those that are even a little bit older, the Gen Zs that were, getting married perhaps, weren't able to do that, or they had to have a much smaller wedding. There's all different life stages and key milestones in their life that happened differently because of COVID. So has that shifted their worldview? Absolutely. COVID will have and has had the biggest impact on that generation because they were coming of age during that time. It's fundamentally shifted the way in which they view and see the world. Now, we did our Gen Z study pre-COVID, and then during COVID, we used a smaller sample size and went back and asked some very specific questions. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of how it has shifted. Pre-COVID, we asked Gen Zs, we said, what are your core values, or what are the key things that you want in your life? And they said, I want to enjoy my life, I want to find a great career, and I want to become a better person. Those were their top 3 goals. We resurveyed during COVID and sort of the mid part of COVID, and we asked them that question again. Again, smaller sample size, but we asked them again, and becoming a better person moved into the second place. So they said, I want to enjoy my life, I want to become a better person, and I want to find and have a great career. And so this is really important for organizations and leaders to understand, but it's really important for any of us to understand. If we are a parent, if we're engaging with young people in our community, they want to enjoy life first, and they want to become a better person. And I asked Gen Zs, why? Why did that become so important? And they said, because during COVID, we really recognized how impactful how much of an impact we can make, and how impactful COVID has been on so many people. So many people have suffered. So many people have experienced it in a negative way. And I need to make sure that I'm helping and I'm making the world a better place. And so that really ramped up. The other piece that was interesting is before COVID, we asked, what are some key important drivers for you when you work? They, of course, always want to be part of a team. Even pre-COVID, they said I wanted to have flexibility where I can live and work I'm in this fluid environment. I can choose where I work and when I work. We know that everyone always wants to have a great leader. But living and being part of a team and an organization that really values diversity and inclusion, our data showed at the time it was about 76% said that was a key value for them and key importance in selecting employment. We surveyed during COVID, that jumped to 100%. So what it means is this shifted, that it is no longer a nice to have, it is a must have. And how Gen Zs define diversity and inclusion is radically different than we would as Gen Xers or baby boomers or even millennials. And what they're saying is, yes, we need to have some of the key markers around diversity and inclusion that we're all familiar with. And that may be religion, that may be sexual orientation, it may be cultural background, it may be language, but they add on a whole other layer to that. And they say the things that are important are also, is my uniqueness being celebrated and appreciated across the organization by leaders? So if I am a vegan, if I'm a marathon runner, if I'm a dog mom, right? If I'm someone who lives in a rural community versus an urban one, are these things being considered, accepted, and celebrated? And that's the difference. So I think those are really important pieces that we saw changes during COVID with the Gen Zs.
That is just so well put and so fascinating. So what are the, current, in a nutshell, the ways to engage each generation and the benefits of each generation that they bring to the workforce today?
I think that it is really important to look at the benefits. And that's a key piece, going back to the question about stereotyping, right? So the reason why stereotyping is negative is because we don't want people to feel that they've been put into a box. And it's the same thing when we think about how we collaborate across the different generations. We don't want to put people in a box and say, well, this is the only thing you can do, or this is only your strength. It's really about maximizing maximizing the skill sets of the different generations and managing any of the conflict or I had another word. I've lost it. I'm sorry. But a friction point. That's what I meant. Conflict or friction points. Sometimes conflict's a little too strong, but a little friction that can happen between the generations. We want to maximize the strengths. And so what we know is that really asking people what are their strengths is the easiest one to figure out. Are there some, broad strengths that each generation brings? Absolutely. If we want to talk about our traditionalists and our traditionalist-minded individuals, they are incredibly loyal. They're very committed to organizational goals. That's where they place that loyalty. They really understand the need to engage broadly stakeholders, and they're much more likely to follow along with the company policies and procedures. And in fact, we saw in our research that Gen Zs are bringing back some very traditionalist values. The baby boomers, very, very well known for being politically savvy, being able to collaborate and engage people across teams to solicit different ideas and different opinions. They really want to add value. They want to contribute in an organization. They want to make sure that they stand out. Why? Because there's 9.6 million baby boomers in Canada, 78 million in the US. So they were accustomed to making sure that they could differentiate themselves. When we think about the Gen Xers, our generation, Dr. Laura, is one that is incredibly results focused, sometimes a little too result focused, but we look at less about the process that it took you to get there and more about the outcome. That's really important for the Gen Xer, as well as collaboration in a different way. Let's figure out who has the great expertise. Let's empower those people to go do the work that they need to do. We'll bring it back together and see if it fits, tweak it as needed, and then go away. So much more of an independent streak. The Millennials have brought in some really interesting collaboration tools, obviously leveraging technology, but hyper collaboration with people. So it becomes ongoing dialogue, becomes ongoing feedback, it becomes an ongoing role that they play in co-creating with anyone a particular outcome, a solution, and they really want to make sure that they engage everyone. And sometimes they're much more informal, a little more friendly with the people they work with. And what do the Gen Zs bring? They bring a lot of things. High levels of innovation and creativity, absolutely. This is a generation that actually really wants to be part of an organization. 89% of those in our study said that they wanted to stay with an employer for a long time. Now, what's a long time to a Gen Z? Probably a little shorter than what we would have thought. but they want to stay, they want to contribute. So they want to do that by sharing ideas, by problem solving, and by contributing early in their careers. They don't want to wait a year or two before they can be asked to be engaged. They want to contribute. So what does that mean on a team? We can really make sure that we leverage them for some fresh thinking.
Okay, so lots of strengths for each generation or generational mindset. Now, can you name maybe two different common clashes, just two examples of clashes and what organizations can do about clashes in general to help these generations to really collaborate better?
Oh, there are so many, because really we're called because of the clashes, to be honest, right? The reason why, 20 plus years later, there's still work in this space for me is because people have the clashes. So some of the big ones, communication. Now, communication always a challenge if you just have two humans working together. And when you add a third and a fourth and a fifth, there's probably going to be communication challenges. But communication across the generations is really unique. One is, what's the medium we're using? So are you WhatsApping me? Are you Teamsing me? Are you Slacking me, right? Where are we communicating? How are we communicating? How formal is that communication? How clear are we in that communication? How inclusive are we with other people? What does that look like? Am I being included enough in the discussion and dialogue? Younger people wanting to be engaged at higher levels within an organization and senior levels saying, I'm sorry, this wasn't for you to give input on, right? Our directional strategy of the bank, I'm sorry, but yes, you were not invited to contribute to that. So there's often clashes as it relates to how and when we communicate, the frequency, and really working with teams to understand what is the team communication protocol up front is really critical. The other piece that comes into play is around work styles. So as I mentioned before, every single generation has a work ethic. But when we don't understand somebody's work style, we make an assumption about their work ethic. And so when people work differently than we do, often we hear from more experienced generations that they believe younger people are not as committed. Just came out of a meeting about that the other day. So when we think about it in this way, what really baby boomers and Gen Xers are saying is, I don't think younger people are working hard enough because they're not in the office, because they're not putting in a 70-hour work week, because they're not willing to cancel their vacation the way I used to cancel my vacation, because they are going to yoga at lunchtime and taking extra time, or they're at their children's sporting event at 4 o'clock. And the way in which people have structured their lives is much more fluid, and I know that is certainly your area of expertise. But it's the demand and the ask for that and the expectation that should happen, and senior people saying, I don't think we want to bend that much.
Yes, and I see lots of judgment, lots of preconceived notions about younger generations being lazy, not hardworking, and like you said, not committed. And I feel like there's so much variability in that as well. And I see so many hardworking ones and so many who are so much faster at the technologies and the tools. And then I see judgments around boomers, for instance, being slow to adopt technologies. But again, there's some boomers who are excellent at it. And I think it's about making sure there's the training available and not just throwing people into new technologies. Do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, anytime we have some new technology, there's always a potential friction point. Are we going to adopt the technology first and foremost? I mean, I'm old enough to remember when, organizations said they may not allow us to go on the internet, right? The idea that, and we're having that same conversation now in organizations about AI, right? But, email, when that came out, I mean, again, I'm of a generation where I remember, and they thought everyone was just going to be emailing their friends all day and somehow we weren't going to get work done. So anytime there's an introduction of technology, there's always this funny notion that productivity is going to go out the window and nobody's going to do anything. There's also the inherent bias against people that are older that say, oh, you're not going to be quick enough to adopt to the technology. Sometimes the technology doesn't need to be adopted. It's cool, but we don't need it, right? It's great, but it doesn't necessarily need to be implemented. And organizations might rush to implement technology a little too quickly. and not support any of the generations. And we hear a lot from Gen Zs all the time. Yeah, they might enjoy technology in certain ways, but they have not been trained and skilled in PowerPoint and Excel and Word. They didn't grow up with Microsoft Office, right? They're using Google and Gmail and Google Meet, and they're using a whole bunch of things, and they come in an organization and someone throws them a spreadsheet and says, oh, I figure you're young, you can whip this up. And they say, I don't even know what you're talking about. Why would we use this? What's Excel? So there are so many different places where we do have to unpack and understand how we're going to work well together and what does that look like. Communicating expectations is one of the key things, and that is still a friction point. Really understanding what are the core values, expectations, and behaviors of that generation and that individual, and then aligning that with the team and the leader and the organization's goals. So what we speak about for organizations is a model called transparency, responsiveness, and partnering, TRP. And organizations need to be transparent about their motives and intentions, and they need to connect the work that younger people are doing to the big picture. That's important for everybody, but it's particularly important for younger employees. Responsiveness is really going to teams and asking employees for their ideas, their opinions, their suggestions. That's important for everyone. It's particularly important for your youngest colleagues and youngest employees. And then managing expectations to say, this is your idea. That's great. That's so cool, right? That you think that we should all be able to have a month off and be able to volunteer and build schools in Africa. That program isn't being implemented yet. But what we are going to be able to do is give you, 5 days a year that you can use as volunteer hours as you wish. So managing those expectations. And then the third is partnering and saying, how are we going to partner together to ensure a win-win? And no longer is it just the organization wins, which was the old days, right? You come in, you work for me, and you'll have to do anything I say. And also, we're not going to have the environment where just employees win and the organization doesn't. It has to be mutual. And so it's really embracing that concept that we're going to find a win-win and that organizations are going to be able to adapt to the employee needs and expectations and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the past, a lot, it was all about the organization winning and the people were the resources to do it versus the people are humans with needs and we need to balance their needs with the corporate profitability and performance. And one goes with the other, right? They're very symbiotic.
Yes. And whether it's in a for-profit or not-for-profit, right? If you're in government, or you are in the not-for-profit sector, it's still about making sure that you're engaging and collaborating with employees well, that you're delivering on your key performance indicators, that you are, being able to establish strong relationship with stakeholders. So it's absolutely symbiotic. You will not be able to hit your business targets and organizational goals if you do not have engaged employees. And you won't have engaged employees if you cannot be more transparent, more responsive, and more partnering all the way along the employee life cycle, from the minute you recruit them all the way through to the time that they leave your organization. They need to have that experience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I have 2 final questions before we wrap up that I ask all my guests. Giselle, I know you're all about educating and training and developing organizations and people, but what do you do for your own growth and development? What's a book or a podcast or something that you love for your own growth?
Great question. And I'm glad I didn't know that question in advance because I'd probably overthink it. So a couple things that I do. I find something in my life that I want to learn that is not professionally focused, actually. So I feel that often when I can stretch my muscle in something else, it gives me energy to bring back to my career. So I've been working on and focusing in on my yoga practice for the last couple of years, but really in the last year with the focus around flexibility and mobility and making sure that I can continue to be flexible. And so when I take courses or I read about that or I learn about a new technique, that is learning for me outside of my career, but I find that really inspires me. The other is that I do attend different retreats. I'm actually just going to be heading to a leadership retreat in Costa Rica as a vacation time. But it is both a leadership and a personal development event. And so I'm really looking forward to that because it combines both the health and wellness perspective, but it also includes goal setting and making sure that we can be clear about, some of the things we want to achieve in our lives, and I'll be including both personal and professional goals. So I'd like to seek out experts that can help with that and really guide me. And I feel like that's a chance that I get to be a student and to learn.
Wonderful. I can't wait to hear how that goes. Let's debrief when you're back. Okay. I think that'd be a fascinating experience. And I'd love to go to Costa Rica. So fill me in. My last question is if you had one wish for a better world when it comes to generations at work, what would it be?
I think that it's the same thing that we really set out to do over 20 years ago. As I said, how do we maximize the skill sets of the different generations that we work with while managing any of the friction points so that we can have more high-performing, more collaborative, more engaged teams? I think that's the vision. And it's not about sugarcoating it. It's not about not talking about it. It's not about ignoring that it's not there. It's about saying we have different perspectives, we have different points of view. We want to discuss it, we want to debate it, we want to problem solve it together, and we want to really be able to create an environment where we can understand where someone's coming from. We may not agree with them, but we can understand their point of view, and then we can find a middle ground. And that is happening in lots of organizations, and yet there's still lots of work to be done.
Wonderful. And I really resonate with that. Thank you. There's so much opportunity if we can get all the generations imparting their different strengths and skills and minimizing that friction, because together they're so much stronger than any one generation is on their own. So thank you, Giselle, for all that you've shared and imparted today and continue to do around generations in the workplace.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and happy to always have the discussion. And the fun thing about this topic is there's always something new to learn. So new Gen Z research to come. So stay tuned.
Can't wait to hear about it, and I hope you stay well. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Where Work Meets Life. If you found this content valuable, please rate and review the episode and share with others who may benefit. Visit me on my website at drlaura.live and sign up for my monthly e-newsletter full of tips and resources. I'm also a passionate keynote speaker and would be delighted to speak with you on your speaking needs. Stay well.